Hello, everyone. My name is Spencer Walsh. Welcome to today's show. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a great one, as always. Great to be back here on this Monday evening. We have some big news for one of the most powerful blocs of countries in the world. NATO has got a new member. Turkey just dropped their objections to supporting Sweden's NATO bid. So now both those two Nordic countries, Sweden and Finland, will now be taking up membership of NATO, which could be a very big deal. We'll take a look at the consequences of that and also the possibility of Ukraine joining. Meanwhile, big moment for the Democrats as AOC has endorsed President Joe Biden's re-election campaign. We'll take a look at all the reaction, and I will give you my take on what that means for the left. Also, kind of going along with that, we talked about Mike Connolly out in Cambridge. He has decided to leave the DSA rather than come together to work for a solution, and we're unfortunately going to have to end the show on a pretty dark and gruesome note because probably not the first, but we have had another case of a mom pleading guilty to helping her daughter end her pregnancy, and they will now both be sentenced out in Nebraska. We'll give you the details on that to close things out. It is a Monday news flash. Thanks so much for joining us here today. All right, we are starting at the top with some pretty big news for one of the most powerful blocs of countries, if not, literally the most powerful bloc of countries in the world. We have NATO and a really shocking decision here by Turkey. Who knows what conversations we'll have that's were had. That's definitely something that we will never know. But yeah, you have NATO, just obviously the military alliance that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you have what was really kind of a surprising decision. We expected Turkey. A lot of people expected Turkey after they really dragged their feet on the Finland ascension for quite a long time. Turkey is kind of viewed as the kind of ugly duckling of NATO. There are times where U.S. interests and Turkey's interests directly contradict, but they're kind of kept in there because they're an important bulwark to at least have some sort of leverage for them in that part of the world. The West can kind of say, don't you want your NATO protections? Really hold that over the head. At times they had aspirations of possibly getting to the EU. That's kind of off the table, but for a really long period of time, they have been a kind of black sheep for a lot of NATO members. And Erdogan, a lot of that has been because of Erdogan. Erdogan just won re-election, and he has already been making it pretty darn tough for Turkey, not for Turkey, but really for the West, because the Finland thing was one thing. Now they, he was expected to really drag his feet over the Sweden nomination because of their supposed support for, as we talked about last time on the show, the Kurds. I believe we talked about it a few shows ago. For some reason, I'm just forgetting what we last talked about on the show, which is like, oh my goodness. But anyway, it's now we are getting to a point where. I don't know, maybe some assurances were made, some conversations were had, some pressure was applied, but his main objection, which is the harboring the alleged support that Sweden's giving to the Kurds, which is the kind of rebel militant group for the outskirts of Turkey, which has been a pretty constant force in terms of fighting and a lot of oppression, frankly, from Erdogan, kind of one of the largest ethnic groups without a state to call their own, and yeah, they've been kind of used by the Americans to fight ISIS. But anyway, that was the big their support for the Kurdish, as they see them, terrorists in the Turkish government who are always agitating for their own state and more rights from Turkey. They're very left wing, by the way, but they were big anti-Erdogan bloc, but now he has dropped that opposition. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who's a big Ukraine hawk, by the way, announced Turkey's decision from Vilnius, Lithuania, where the alliance was preparing to open its annual summit on Tuesday. So Stoltenberg said that Erdogan had lifted his objections to Sweden's entry into the alliance and would take the country's bid to his parliament for ratification as soon as possible. In return, Sweden and Turkey would continue to work bilaterally against terrorism. Sweden would help reinvigorate Turkey's application to enter the European Union, which is something that was a pretty big concession because that was really off the table for a long time for the West. Turkey or Sweden helping Turkey get into that European Union club would be a very, very big deal. That's something that would really probably help their economy to kind of bind it up with the EU. And NATO would establish a new special coordinator for counterterrorism. So pretty big, concessions won there from Erdogan, who, by the way, is not really concerned in this kind of, from this BRICS perspective of, we want to see peace coming in here, not necessarily the most antagonistic towards Russia. I don't think Erdogan and really probably a lot of the people in Turkey care one way or the other about what happens in this Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Erdogan saw opportunity to advance his priorities, and boy, did he get what it seems like here, a lot of his priorities addressed. So that is looking pretty good for him. But for the rest of the world, it's probably, I'm not going to say probably, it's not the best thing, and is, for a probably equal international world is not a good sign to see more members of NATO and NATO, just general NATO expansion, because that's going to, again, we have to, obviously make the disclaimer, a lot of the concerns that Russia had in terms of, invading and all this kind of justification, it really wasn't, it seems, about, if you look at it logically, these fears about NATO expansion, things like that were, kind of bubbling under the surface, but didn't really accelerate at any time when they chose to do the invasion. But this provides, if anything, at the very least, the expansion of NATO, the adding more members right around Russia's border, just feeds into more and more, just like the cluster bombs, it helps them lose their sense of moral superiority, not to say that Russia gains any moral superiority, but they have less of a high ground to stand on if they're sending cluster bombs, if they're feeding into the stated legitimate Russian concerns, I have to say, of NATO encirclement around what, hostile countries connected to probably one of Russia's most, clear enemies, the United States, deeply connected to the United States, and having a absolute security guarantee from the United States, having all those countries around his border is not something Russia's going to like, no matter what. And feeding into those concerns, giving this kind of conspiracy theorist type of, deeply isolated kind of crazy person in Putin, this weapon to go to his people and say, look at what he's doing here. Look at what the United States is doing. Biden's pushing NATO to expand. We're getting encircled by the U.S., yada, yada. That is becoming more and more true. And that also is not something that is helpful for peace by any stretch of the imagination. So it is, in my opinion, something really to not exactly celebrate. It's probably a pretty big escalation. Russia will take it as a big escalation. Do they have the wherewithal to, maybe try and do something with China? It's certainly possible, but I think it's really clear that a desperate Russia, especially a nuclear-armed desperate Russia, is not a good thing to encourage. So, in my opinion, here, something to not celebrate really in any stretch, but it seems like it's mostly going to be around terrorism and things of that nature. So yeah, we got to look at it from two perspectives here. For the Erdogan perspective, it looks like he really got a lot on his own personal priorities, dealing with Kurdish, quote unquote, terrorism in and around the country. And that's just having a bigger role in the European community, enhancing the role in NATO, getting NATO to do more things for him, and of course getting that vaunted EU membership badge. That would definitely be something that would be an emboldening to the EU and a big, big win for Turkey. And with those two things, it seems like his priorities are getting addressed. We'll see the tests of that commitment to Sweden help them get in the EU, but as time goes on. But now, if you're looking at it from the broader world peace perspective, I don't think that adding more countries to NATO and a move that's sure to antagonize Russia even further is going to be something that will help with that at all. All right, we'll move on to our next story. AOC making a big announcement next. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening and supporting Newsflash. We now have a brand new way for you to be heard if you want, whether a text message or a audio message. Please, no video messages. I really just do not think that's necessary. We have a new feedback box open for you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is officially open. SWRN702@gmail.com. Send a text message, send a voice message of no more than 30 seconds via the voice memos function. Either of those two options, and we will 100%, not going to find this guarantee anywhere else. We're going to play it on the show, listen to what you have to say, and it literally could be about anything. Well, if it's inappropriate, we won't play it, but it could be about anything. Thank you so much. This is my thank you to all the listeners who have stuck out with us and want to have their own voice in the show. SWRN702@gmail.com is the address. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have some pretty big news. AOC endorsing Joe Biden, and it really just kind of bring up a pretty, it's pretty. I have some pretty conflicted thoughts about this, especially starting with the place that she did it, which was we talked about this with Jack Neeker, the Pod Save America podcast, which if she is. And I kind of go back and forth on this. It's like, what's the smart politician move? What's the, move that would make me feel the best? Because, you got to be honest, if you're thinking smartly, they're not always going to be aligned. But the Pod Save America podcast is probably one of the most anti-Bernie, anti-left-wing, forces, just a complete organ of Democratic Party, kind of liberal, left, sometimes left liberal, but mostly kind of hardcore Biden-esque, Hillary-esque propaganda. They're the first people to harangue the left. They're, kind of the, rear guard, the people who are going to be the people who go first to the left and say, you guys are being ridiculous. You guys are doing too much here. You guys need to calm down. They're big anti-Bernie people in the primary. They've always been left skeptical. And here is AOC on their podcast saying this.
So president's only primary opponents are Marianne Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Haven't been any rumors about anyone else even thinking about jumping in. Will you be supporting Joe Biden for re-election?
I believe given that field, yes. I think he's done quite well, given the limitations that we have. I do think that there are ebbs and flows, as there are in any presidency. There are areas that I think were quite strong when he came right out of the gate with the American Rescue Plan. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act was a massive step in terms of our climate agenda. But, there are also areas that I think could have gone better. We have major structural issues in this country, and I think it starts with the United States Senate. And I think that until we have senators that are willing to stand up and stare the filibuster in the eye and stare a lot of structural issues about the Senate, and the United States Senate will be what holds back this country from an enormous amount of progress.
So that's what she's talking about. So essentially, again, it's really kind of tough thing to evaluate here, because on one hand you have the kind of superficial, like she's going on Pod Save America, bending the knee in a really big way to Joe Biden, saying, if you're not the most effusive praise of him for sure, saying when we look at the field, this is what we have. But there's, definitely several things to kind of dislike about that in a very strong way, just on the substance of it. So first, you're saying, again, you got what's to like, honestly, endorsing Biden, I have to say, is probably. It's just not necessary at this time. Like, you can say, I'm supporting Biden. You don't have to come out and support for Marianne or come out and support for, there's just no reason to have this completely uncritical line of Biden. If you're in a safe Democratic seat, you don't have to go all out against him. There's definitely been a lot of, push and pressure from her, especially internal sources, but you don't have to go, to this big way all out against or for Biden. She didn't embarrass herself, but offering support this early is just completely unnecessary and completely unstrategic. Going on this message, going on this podcast, maybe she's just trying to cater to some of the Democratic Party loyalists. And with AOC, I'd say honestly, it's becoming an increasingly mixed bag. Because, there's a certain thing that's like, I don't see the political utility in coming out for one of these, presidential campaigns, that's not really going to go anywhere. You're talking about Marianne, talking about RFK. Maybe, I hate to be honest, but Cornel West, it's probably not in her best interest to do that. But coming on this podcast and saying, oh, I love, not saying I love Joe Biden, but saying, given the field, I have to support Joe Biden now. It's just saying, the answer there could have been, and again, I object to really the utility of going on, Pod Save America in the first place. It's just signaling. And if you're signaling to a very small group of people, that's not your base. Your base isn't out there listening to Pod Save America. Go talk, do another town hall. It really shows you the people that she values. I think is just that choice going on Pod Save America in the first place, and it's not really the people that got her elected. And if she has these broader aspirations, which it's not a crazy thing to say that she does, she's you can see her making that kind of time. What I would argue a mistake is to go to these professional class, upper middle class, liberal people who would listen to Pod Save America in kind of big blue states, and almost, I hate to say it, Kamala Harrisizing her in going to that place. There's a lot of, if you want to go to the people that really, got her elected, these, equally, white, probably less wealthy than the Pod Save listeners, but, the DSA type people. We're going to get into some of those people in a moment, but, there's other podcasts, other media places you can go to, and talk to those type of people. Tons of independent media sources with those people who actually got her elected time and time again, are going to listen, and they're going to say, okay, I get what you're doing here. I see, she's strategy, and you got much more engaged, much more, actively, nonpartisan hack hosts who are going to come in and say, why are you doing this? What's the strategy here? What's the game plan? Here's where you could have done better on this. Why didn't you actually give her, hold her accountable in a way that is not antagonistic, but constructive, and saying, unlike, and we'll get in, it's a very interesting kind of related situation with Mike Connolly in Boston, and we'll get to it in a minute. But, I think that is something that really signals in a very disturbing way, she is turning away from her base to a different sect of the Democratic Party, which did not get her elected, which is not kind of her home turf, and isn't going to really rally for her when it comes push to shove. And another example of this, and it's another example of what could broadly be summed up as DC brain. And she's talking about the filibuster. The filibuster was definitely a problem, but the weight she puts on it is just completely nonsensical and just not related in any way to the political reality at hand. It just gives Biden way too much credit, or way too little credit. And way too little agency. We're talking about denying people agency on certain parts of the Democratic Party base. How about denying Joe Biden the agency of, he's the president? He did nothing over the first year and a half of his presidency. It was the biggest theme of the show at the time. He did absolutely nothing to try and, incentivize Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema in any way other than writing them strongly worded letters. He was not serious. And some of the responsibility has to be said. Pramila Jayapal, AOC, Progressive Caucus, writ large, totally let him off the hook for that. So it's like, what is he gonna really do there? He is doing the same old thing. But if you let it happen, you're also incredibly complicit. And it just shows really another case of DC brain turning away from the base. I don't, object to, at the heart of hearts, her endorsing Biden. Or saying, or not coming out, I do object to her endorsing Biden, actually, but what I don't object to is her not supporting one of these other left-wing campaigns, but the complete and utter lack of any ability to position yourself in any way antagonistic to Biden, in any real way, and just kind of working around and just foregoing the electoral scene entirely even on a national level. And giving a speech at a Teamsters practice picket line, which isn't bad, but it's really not. It's really not doing the other parts as well, where you have the power, where you have the base to actually back you up. That kind of stuff is just not in any way encouraging, and it just shows you she's just going in a completely wrong direction. It's DC brain. It's DC brain is what makes you go on Pod Save America. Maybe not go on I think there's totally plenty of capable left-wing media outlets and operations. I'm thinking of from Ryan Grimm to even a place like Chapo Trap. I think Crystal Ball, for example, would give her a pretty good interview. It's like there's people that she doesn't because it would be probably it would be poo-pooed on DC that you're not supposed to be giving interviews to non-legacy media sources. When it comes to real internal matters like this, I think it's a great way to actually get in touch with your people. And the messaging on this stuff, also not good at all, completely missing the point, and shows, she does not have this kind of mindset of being a fighter anymore. And it is she's completely given up on being a renegade and, playing within the game. And playing within the game is just limiting it's not how you do your own type of politics. It's how you work within someone else's politics. You may score some wins, but, you ultimately are being controlled. You're within the walls of a system that's controlled by, someone like Joe Biden. When, you have a base, excuse me, you have a base of people that are willing to support you and do a lot for you. It may not be the biggest base in the world. It may seem daunting a little bit compared to the Democrats, but you have a base of people willing to support you in doing these things, these antagonistic things, a la Tea Party type style. But you are not doing any of it. You're just not, and it's just you're not even trying. I think there's a lot of the really reason that there's not even a popular fight to be picked with these people, which I think is a big problem that a lot of people have, and a very, very fair one. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit, but not really, as we go to our next story. This is in the Cambridge Day. So State Representative Mike Connolly has decided to leave the Boston chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, he announced Monday. Connolly's decision comes after Boston DSA, so he's a state rep, again in Boston, the Cambridge area. Connolly's decision comes after the Boston DSA introduced a motion last week to expel him. In the motion, a group charged Connolly with a variety of offenses, including endorsing Governor Maura Healey and not participating in the organization's endorsement process. Boston DSA, I think it was just it's a really kind of dishonest charge, which I think actually, does leave out a whole part of the story, which is, I'm getting to why it's dishonest in a moment, because but let's go on a little bit here. Rather than fighting these charges for much of July, a particularly busy time for the Massachusetts General Court, Connolly said he will devote his energy to serving his constituents in Cambridge and Somerville. He's been a reliably progressive candidate and legislator, pushing for electoral reform, criminal justice reform, and affordable housing, including rent control and the new notion of social housing. I need to focus on continuing to represent our community on Beacon Hill and delivering for my constituents, he said. And again, so it goes, and reading this article, it goes on to pretty much editorialize about the charges against Mike Connolly from a position of pro-Mike Connolly, essentially. And, he's, and we talked about some of the nature of the charges on Friday, which is a bunch of stuff that was, you didn't endorse exactly the way you wanted to endorse. Some, you looked approvingly at a senator who we don't exactly like. A lot of that stuff was, in my opinion, way, way too antagonistic. And there was a real charge, which I think the biggest real charge was endorsing against the DSA, which as a member of the DSA, you just should not be able to do. Which, I think that was, a completely fair charge, but all this other stuff and, doing a expulsion rather than a censure, rather than a condemnation, or some sort of suspension, I don't know, I think is, a completely, fair thing to consider, which literally is what they did. So they released over the weekend a amendment to the original charges to say, we just want to censure this guy. We don't want to expel him, and they dropped all the charges except for the anti-endorsement charge. Then Connolly, in response to that, which is a significant step down, said, okay, I'm taking my ball, I'm going home, I'm not going to be part of this organization anymore, which I think is a pretty sad thing. And I think there is pretty much, really some, I hate to be the kind of the boring one here again, but there's equal fault on both sides. I think DSA made the original mistake. It's got to be real. When they, went very heavy-handed on Connolly, they did a lot of, they talked about expulsion. They put in a lot of charges that were pretty BS. I think it's, at the end of the day, it's kind of fine to endorse Maura Healey. Endorse who you want to endorse, as long as it's not someone completely egregious. But don't endorse against the DSA as well. But I think those are, fair things to consider, but they went way too hard on him. Connolly, I think probably a little bit egotistically turned around and said, this is ridiculous, but he had a point. They then backed down, they slimmed down their charges, and they said, we need to just censure this guy. It's not that big a deal. We're focusing on the charges that are really problematic. And from there, it seemed like we're gonna have a resolution, but it really comes down to the principle of the inability to just be cool with people who are clearly on your side. Like Mike Connolly and the DSA should be working in lockstep 99.9% of the time. But, one thing goes wrong. DSA, I think they come down, they realize their mistake. Connolly rightfully has a good reason to be, pretty pissed about it, but they come down, they realize their mistake, and I think the mistake was, being way too aggressive and way too ideologically, rigid. And then Connolly pulls back and says, in this, very dramatic manner against someone who should be your friend in politics. Oh, and again, they really made a big effort to amend the charges. That was not acknowledged by the Connolly camp whatsoever. He just comes in and says, if you guys are going to do that, it's kind of I guess screw me, right? Like he just takes that very narcissistic approach of being like, if they just don't want to work together at all, I'm just sick and tired of it. I'm getting out of here. And like that's just come on. It's like really, this is a membership organization. It's really aligned with you. It's doing good work all up and down the country. And instead of, saying, hey, they made a mistake, they're trying to adjust it, this is an organization I want to work with, you just take your ball and go home. But again, obviously, same applies to the DSA. And this is why you hear all this talk about DSA losing members, people on the left falling apart, and just the general splitting and fracturing that's happened since the end of the Bernie campaign. That really shows you, I think pretty conclusively, it's all down to this one principle. It's just people don't know how to be chill with people who are their friends. And if they have disagreements, let's be constructive about it. Let's come to a common resolution we can both agree on. And then I have not seen a DSA type of fight, and I'm really not involved in a lot of DSA. I'm not a member of the DSA or anything like that. But I've followed some of the news about it, and I've not seen a DSA fight that's like, okay, clearly you can come talk about this. And, especially with DSA politician relationships, that's like, okay, you can clearly come talk about this. You work together, very similar beliefs. Why don't we come sort this out, come to a resolution, and, we can have a dialogue here. It could be a harsh dialogue, but it does not need to be a dialogue so harsh that, we take our ball and go home. And I think, Connolly should have been a little bit more understanding with the DSA in this situation. All right. We now go to our final story. It's a pretty dark story, and it goes and revolves around the abortion crusade in Nebraska. A Nebraska woman took a plea deal on Friday in a case that involved her ordering abortion pills for her teenage daughter. Self-managed abortion is not explicitly illegal in the state. Only Nevada and South Carolina ban it, but prosecutors can and do criminalize people for abortion, miscarriage, and stillbirth by charging them under other statutes. In this case, the mother had 5 charges brought against her, including concealing a death and false reporting. Advocates worry these kinds of charges will become more frequent as millions live in states under abortion bans. Jessica Burgess admitted to helping her daughter end her pregnancy in the spring of 2022 before the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. This is, again, a post, I don't know if I'm using this right, but a post facto, after the fact, kind of prosecution here. Before the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, Madison County prosecutors claimed that in April 2022, Burgess gave abortion pills to her then 17-year-old daughter, Celeste, who gave birth to a stillborn fetus estimated at 29 weeks gestation. The pair then burned and buried the remains with the help of another person, a 21-year-old man who only got probation, which is, great. Totally fair there. Someone then tipped off the police that Celeste had a stillbirth and buried the remains. Cops obtained a warrant for Facebook messages between her and her mother. Facebook parent company Meta complied and provided the messages in which the pair allegedly discussed ending Celeste's pregnancy with the pills. A friend of Celeste also told the police, some friend, that she was there when Celeste took the first abortion pill. Most people charged for self-managed abortion were reported by healthcare workers or friends and acquaintances, which is a pretty remarkable stuff there. Pressure of the law, all that. Celeste was charged as an adult and pled guilty in May. She faces a 2-year prison sentence. All right. So she originally pleaded guilty to not guilty to 5 charges, for which she faced 8 years in prison. And on Friday, she pled guilty to 3: tampering with human skeletal remains, false reporting, and abortion. After 20 weeks gestation, the state dismissed the other 2. She now faces up to 2 years in prison, which is, relative to other amount of years, may not seem like a lot, but, absolutely life-ruining, life-disrupting, all that kind of stuff. Especially in that kind of culture, all that. It's just a really, really horrific situation, and it's like this is a real step back, I feel like, in America, and it's a big reason why so many people are so outraged about it in so many parts of the country, is because it feels like we're regressing as a society. Like whether most people have relatively in the middle stances on abortion. I think the numbers do back that out, but I think really people see this. Really, and it just contributes to the feeling we are living in a completely backwards, regressing, degrading society, all of that. And it really, really shows you just the awfulness of the situation on a just human level, and complete thoughts and sympathies in every single possible way to the family, and so many other cases that are going on all across Red America. That being said, we'll be back on Wednesday, hopefully with a guest.